3 weeks after I spent $62,000 rebuilding his building from the studs up, my landlord handed me a 30-day notice and called it owner occupancy. I remember the smell of fresh paint still lingering in the air. The pale oak flooring I'd installed 3 weeks earlier hadn't even finished curing. He smiled when he handed it to me almost gently, like he thought he was doing me a favor. What he didn't know was that handing me that notice would set something in motion that wouldn't fully close for another 8 months. And when it finally did, his name would not be the only one on the file. But to understand why that mattered, you need to know exactly who my landlord was and why I almost let him win. By the end of this, you will understand how a number most tenants never think to look up 6 digits, printed on a government license, became the only thing standing between my landlord and a clean getaway. Not a lawsuit alone. Not a confrontation in a parking lot. A number. And the bond quietly attached to it. I had run my bridal boutique for 6 years before I ever met the man who owned the building I eventually leased from him. Word of mouth built that business and the fact that I never once missed an alteration deadline. Brides remember that. Mothers of brides remember it even more. The other thing people remembered about me was that I paid every vendor, every supplier, every contractor on the first of the month, without fail, even in years when the math was tight. When my old lease ended and the strip mall I'd been renting in announced a teardown, I needed a new home for the business fast. The unit my landlord offered sat on a quiet corner 2 blocks from the courthouse, a beautiful brick facade, high ceilings, completely gutted on the inside. He met me there himself, instead of sending an agent, a basket of pastries from the bakery next door in one hand, and told me, almost the moment we shook hands, that he could already see exactly what I'd do with the space. He said it the way people say something they actually mean. The lease he offered included what's called a tenant improvement allowance language that let me put money into the build-out in exchange for a rent credit once construction was verified complete. He walked me through that section personally, told me he'd never once had a problem honoring it in 15 years of owning the building. He showed me 2 other properties he managed, both occupied, both looking fine. I had no reason to doubt any of it, so I signed. And then I spent the next 4 months turning a gutted brick shell into something brides cried over the first time they saw it. New flooring. New plumbing for a steam press station. Custom-built fitting rooms with the kind of lighting that makes every dress look like the one. $62,000 paid out of savings and a small loan because the lease said the credit would arrive once everything was finished and verified. There was a night near the end of that build-out when my husband found me at our kitchen table at midnight. Going through invoices for the 3rd time that week, double-checking that every number matched what the lease promised I'd get back. He asked if I was sure about this landlord. I told him the contract was clear. I told him I trusted a man who'd shaken my hand like he meant it. 3 weeks after the last contractor packed up his tools. The credit I was owed had not appeared on a single rent statement. Calls to his office started taking 2 days to return, then 3, then 4, when they were returned at all. That was the first thing that felt wrong. His name was Roland Vance, and I would learn over the following weeks that very little about him was what it first appeared to be. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday morning, taped to the glass door instead of mailed 30 days, citing owner's intent to occupy the premises for personal business use. No mention of the renovation credit. No mention of the lease language we'd both signed. Just 30 days. And a phone number for his office that I already knew would take days to answer. I called an attorney before I called him back. She told me what most attorneys tell tenants in that situation. Improvements installed in a leased space typically become fixtures the landlord's property, unless the lease specifically guarantees compensation if a tenant is displaced early. I pulled my copy and read her the relevant paragraph. It did guarantee it. She said that was good. She also said good didn't always mean enforceable, without a fight that could cost more than the $62,000 I was trying to get back. The second thing I found came 4 days later, almost by accident. A friend forwarded me a commercial listing she'd seen online, a beautiful corner retail space, 2 blocks from the courthouse, recently renovated, move-in ready. The photos were mine. My flooring, my fitting room lighting, my steam press hookup, photographed at an angle that made it look like someone else's idea entirely. The listing had gone live 6 days before my eviction notice arrived. But the third thing I found was the one that stopped me cold. The listing platform kept a public history log when a draft was first created, not just when it went live. I checked it out of pure stubbornness, expecting nothing. The draft had been created 11 days before my final contractor walked through. 11 days before my own construction was even finished, Roland Vance had already built a marketing listing for my space. This wasn't a landlord who suddenly needed his building back. This was a plan that had been running quietly underneath mine the entire time. I started asking around the building after that other tenants, a woman who ran the dry cleaner 2 doors down. That's when I heard about Renata. Renata had run a small coffee shop in the same building 14 months before I ever signed my lease. She'd put $38,000 into her own build-out under what she described as nearly identical promises. She got the same 30-day notice, the same owner-occupancy language. She told me she'd called 3 attorneys, gotten the same answer I just had about the cost of fighting it, and eventually walked away with nothing. She never recovered a cent. She didn't know there was anywhere else to take it. I sat in my car outside the empty unit the night I learned all of this, doing the math on a notepad balanced against the steering wheel. 62,000 of mine, 38,000 of Renata's. At least 2 build-outs, paid for by 2 women who trusted the same handshake, both standing now in front of buildings that weren't theirs anymore. I wasn't his first. I understood that now. I just didn't yet know how many people had come before Renata, or how many would come after me if nothing changed. That was the night the math stopped being about the money. I called 3 more attorneys that week, hoping one of them would tell me something different. None of them did. The first said tenant improvement disputes were notoriously difficult to win outright unless I could prove bad faith, and proving bad faith in court, she warned, could take a year and cost more than what I was trying to recover. The second told me, almost kindly, that landlords like this usually have better lawyers than the tenants they push out, and that most people in my position eventually settle for whatever buyout gets offered, just to stop the bleeding. The third didn't soften it at all. Word for word, she said, most of these cases just die quietly. I'm sorry. 2 weeks after the eviction notice, Roland Vance's office called not about the credit I was owed, but with an offer. $8,000, paid within 10 days if I signed a release and vacated without further escalation. $8,000 against $62,000 spent. He wasn't even pretending the math made sense. He was betting that exhaustion would close the gap his offer didn't. There was a night, close to that offer's deadline, when I sat in my car, outside the dark storefront at 11 at night. The release sat on the passenger seat, already filled out except for my signature. I stared at the new flooring through the front window, lit only by the streetlight outside, and thought about every Saturday morning I'd spent on my hands and knees with a level, getting it perfectly even. I thought about just signing it. Taking the 8,000. Finding a new building somewhere far from a corner I used to love walking to. I didn't sign that night. I drove home instead, and I didn't sleep much, and by morning I still hadn't decided anything. But somewhere in that sleepless stretch, one detail kept surfacing, something one of the three attorneys had mentioned almost as an aside. The kind of thing lawyers sometimes drop without realizing it matters. She'd mentioned, in passing, that Roland Vance's management company operated under his personal real estate broker's license. I had never once thought to look up what that meant. And then, I did something nobody told me to do. I opened my laptop, found my state's real estate commission website, and typed his name into the license lookup field. The license came back active, 11 years old. Clean on the surface, no public complaints showing in the basic search. But underneath the license number was a second piece of information I almost scrolled past. Every broker licensed in that state is required to maintain a surety bond or contribute to the state's real estate recovery fund, specifically to satisfy financial judgments against them when the broker doesn't pay on his own. It existed for exactly this, for someone wronged through a licensed broker's conduct, with no other practical way to collect what a court said they were owed. A licensing complaint, my first attorney had already told me, wouldn't put $1 back in my account on its own. Boards discipline. They suspend licenses. They don't write checks. But the bond was different. The bond existed specifically to write the check a board couldn't, and only once a judgment existed to attach it to. I made a list that night, not a plan yet, just a list. File the formal complaint with the Real Estate Commission. Pursue the civil breach of lease, claim my attorney could build from the listing's timestamp alone. Get the judgment first, then file against the bond to collect what the judgment ordered. Keep every invoice, every email, every dated screenshot in one folder, in case any piece of it ended up mattering later. And one name kept surfacing in my mind the entire time I wrote that list. Renata's. I filed my complaint on a Thursday morning, sitting at the same kitchen table where my husband had once asked if I was sure about this landlord. I wrote 4 words at the top of the form before anything else: financial loss, licensed broker. Then I sent it. Quietly, alone, no phone call to warn him it was coming. The first response came 6 weeks later, longer than I'd expected, though I'd been warned it would be. An investigator from the Real Estate Commission called to confirm the basic facts of my complaint, then asked for documentation: the lease, the improvement clause, invoices, the listing's draft history screenshot, a written timeline. I sent all of it within 2 days. I'd had it ready for weeks. 3 months passed before I heard anything substantial again. 3 months of running my business out of a borrowed back room at a friend's print shop, doing alterations on a folding table, telling brides I'd find a permanent space soon, and meaning it a little less each time I said it. Then, the investigator called again, and the question she asked wasn't one I expected. She asked how many of Roland Vance's managed properties I'd personally walked through before signing my lease. I told her 2, the ones he'd shown me himself. Both occupied, both looking fine. She was quiet for a moment, then told me the commission had identified 3 other properties under his management with a similar tenant pattern over the past 4 years' businesses that invested in build-out improvements and left within 18 months of finishing them. Mine and Renata's weren't isolated. They were a pattern with a number attached to it now. And the number was bigger than either of us had guessed alone. The commission's findings, when they finally came in writing, were careful in the way official findings always are. They didn't call it fraud. That wasn't a determination they were positioned to make. What they did say was that his conduct, across multiple tenants, showed a documented pattern inconsistent with the financial obligations his license required him to honor, and that disciplinary proceedings against that license would move forward. That finding alone would not have gotten me $1. The civil case moved on its own, separate track. 8 months after I first filed my complaint, it ended with a judgment in my favor for the full $62,000. The listing's 11-day-old draft timestamp had been more than enough to settle the question of intent in front of a judge. With that judgment now on record, I filed a claim against the surety bond tied to his license, the bond explicitly there to satisfy judgments like mine, when the broker himself doesn't pay. The fund covered its full limit, $25,000, within 30 days of my filing. The remaining $37,000 became a standard judgment collection matter slower, but no longer in question. I called Renata the week the commission's pattern letter became public record and told her what they'd found. For the first time in 14 months, she heard there was somewhere left to take her loss. The investigator mentioned something else to me near the end of our last call, almost in passing, that 2 of those other flagged properties were managed under entirely different company names, registered to addresses that traced back to the same family trust. She said the commission's jurisdiction stopped at the state line. Mine didn't have to. And then came the part I did not expect. The retailer who'd signed on to take my old space, the one whose interest had started this entire eviction in the first place, pulled out of the deal within a month of the local news coverage. Word travels fast in a small commercial corridor. Nobody wants to be the next name on a listing with a complicated history. That corner unit sat empty for almost as long as I'd been displaced from it. I found a new building 4 months later, 2 streets over, owned by someone with no connection to Roland Vance at all. The first thing I installed, before the flooring, before the fitting rooms, before anything else, was a small framed copy of my finished tenant improvement clause, every box on it finally checked. None of this gave me back the 4 months I spent altering wedding dresses on a folding table in a borrowed back room. None of it returned the sleepless nights, or the version of that corner building I'd once pictured growing old in. Justice, when it finally arrives, rarely runs on a timeline that feels like enough, and it never hands back the time it cost to get there. What it does is close a door that had been open far longer than anyone realized. Roland Vance's license suspension is permanent now. The bond that once sat quietly unclaimed, waiting for someone to notice it existed, has a different reputation in that state's real estate circles today. Landlords talk the same way tenants eventually do. I wasn't his first tenant to lose money to that pattern. Renata wasn't either. It turned out the investigation eventually surfaced 2 more names neither of us had ever heard, going back further than either of our leases. I was simply the first one to build the folder instead of walking away from it. People ask me sometimes if I'd do anything differently, knowing now how long it took. I tell them the only thing I'd change is looking up that license number on day 1, instead of waiting until I had nothing left to lose by checking. Justice didn't make me whole. It made the next tenant's lease worth something more than a handshake and a basket of pastries. Mine did, 8 months late. But on my own terms. 3 weeks ago, a woman in a state I had never set foot in messaged me after finding a local news clip about the bond ruling. She'd just signed a lease for a flower shop, she said. And something about the build-out language in her contract felt familiar in a way she couldn't quite place. She sent me a photo of the page. Then, almost as an afterthought, a screenshot of her property manager's website, a headshot of the man who'd shown her the space himself, a basket of something in one hand, telling her he could already see exactly what she'd do with it. When she sent me the company's registered name, and I searched the license number behind it, I recognized the structure of the bond, the wording of the clause, the entire shape of it, even though the man's face was someone I had never seen before. If anything in this story sounds familiar to you, the handshake, the basket, the promise that felt too easy, say so in the comments. You may already be one piece of someone else's folder.